Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 14th edition, Spotlight edition of the Frank and Stan chat. And for those of you who have followed us for a while, you know that we do an occasional chat, usually with just one guest. But today we're breaking that mold. We've got two guests with us today. So those of you watching on video can see them at the bottom of the screen. If you're watching on podcast, we'll do a little listening to them on podcast. You'll see that we'll do a little intro in a minute, so you know who these people are. But yeah, we're going to talk about something. We're going to really talk about behaviour, and we're going to talk about, I don't know, relationships, and we're going to talk about all this stuff that I'm experiencing as a grandparent at the moment. And yeah, it's something we've skirted around occasionally. We've skirted around this issue a few times. So it's great to have a couple of guests who've got a new book out, coming out very shortly. I don't know if it's their first. Anna, is your first?
This is our first, yeah.
Wow. Okay, well that's great. So that's coming out in a couple of days. So and there's a discount as well available if you purchase that through the publisher. But anyway, we'll get to that in due course. Stan, how are you?
I'm fine, apart from having a bit of a cough, so I'll be hitting the mute button so we don't end up like something off the Fast Show.
We have this problem here with a certain age, you know, that things happen this way for us. But anyway, let's get to our guests. So let's start with Alan. Alan, do you want to just introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Alan Braven. I've been teaching for about 35 years, recently retired, and school leadership for about 25 years, which is a lot of stress, which is why I retired early, of course.
Of course, yeah, very early.
But I've throughout my career, I've worked in what's been lovingly called schools in challenging circumstances. I'm working with some very interesting children, and I've probably got pretty much a record that every school that I've worked in up until the last one got closed down for one reason or another. They were always seen as being the poor relation, and got teamed up with the good schools that could come and teach us how to do it. But in reality, all of the staff that I worked with all went on to bigger and better things because they were very talented people and knew and understood how to work with complex young people. So that's my background. So it was mainstream mainly, but then ended up in special ed in a federation of special schools across Manchester for children with social, emotional, mental health needs. And that was where I really, thought I knew it all and really didn't, and came in and thought, oh my God, what do I do now? So that was really the start of my journey. And I'm sure we'll come to what I did do later on.
Fabulous. And Anthony?
Hello, so I'm Anthony Benedict. I am currently the CEO of a brand new multi-academy trust which opened in January called Ambition Community Trust. I was an English teacher. And worked in secondary schools for 23 years, and then I went through assistant head, deputy head, head teacher, and then four and a half years ago, I came out of mainstream and took on a PRU in Tameside, and I was the executive head of the PRU there. So I was quarter funded by the authority to reduce permanent exclusion across Tameside, as well as managing a PRU that was borderline inadequate, if I'm honest, when I took it over. And I suppose I've gone through this journey and I've met Alan along the way, but I've completely changed my thinking about what education is and what education does and how we should approach that. But I think I'd have to start again, like with Alan said, I've always worked with the disaffected and the disadvantaged. I always had a classroom full of what everybody else called the naughty children. And I'm really passionate about that. And I think it's taken 27 years for me to admit that I came into teaching to change the world. And it wasn't to shout at children, though I have done plenty of that. And it wasn't to teach them Shakespeare, and I have done plenty of that. But the children are the future, and I genuinely believe that they're the ones that we need to make. That if we're going to make this world a better place, it's those young people that we have to invest in, and that's where a lot of this has come from.
Yeah. Wow. I think that sort of rings quite close to, I think, our journey as well. And I think picking up on what Alan was saying about how striking it is. You can get yourself into a role where you think you can teach, but actually you realize that actually all you've been doing is sort of skating across the sort of easy stuff, the really thick ice, And I remember that teaching year 10 at Co-op Academy Leeds in mathematics. I'm not a mathematician, but then it became very clear to me as a CEO, Anthony, that actually, there's a lot going on here that I know very little about, and it gave me a deep sort of sense of respect for the teachers that were, teaching some of the most challenging kids in that area. So, yeah, that's what struck me, Anthony, when you were telling me that. But anyway, you've got a new book out.
We have.
You have. I mean, you're first. So, go on, give us the background. Is this really a way of sort of offloading all of this stuff that you've gained, and you're seeing the light, Anthony? You needed to pitch something in the sand there to say this was then and this is now.
Yeah.
What's the story behind it?
I'll tell you the story. So, as I said to you, I came out of mainstream 4.5, 5 years ago. I did a bit of consultancy, and then a colleague and I were going to set up our own PRU because, like I said, we're committed to the disaffected and the disadvantaged, and actually it got to a point where a lot of children I'd taught had ended up with quite heavy prison sentences for really, really serious crimes. And what I thought was they were safe in school. They weren't necessarily very academic, but when you get to deputy and head teacher, some of those children sit in your office with you, and you can you can give them a happy experience. Some of them they weren't so good at learning, but they were brilliant at running errands, and they had all sorts of skill set. But then when they left the school, very quickly they fell into difficulty. And so a colleague and I thought, well, it's all right talking about that. Are we actually going to do something differently to try and change that? So we're going to set up our own PRU. It's really difficult to do that, and it's really expensive. And I've got a young family, and they were even younger then. And I think if I'd have spent all my savings on investing it in a PRU, I'd probably be single again now. So that wasn't the best idea. And then the PRU came up in Tameside, and it was one of those jobs where I thought, to be honest, I've got a very clear idea about what I want to do with a PRU, which was about loving children, not in a weird way, obviously, and about feeding them and clothing them and making them feel safe. And I thought, if we can run a PRU like that, then that's what I'll do. So in the interview, I was less bothered about trying to impress the panel and more bothered about saying, this is what my vision is, this is how I'm going to do it differently. And, with jobs like that, you tend to get them, don't you? Because
yeah, but I think this is something here about, in a way it's inevitable, but in some ways it's sad that it takes us all, I think, many, many years to get to a position where we challenge ourselves about what a good education is.
Yeah.
Yes.
And actually, I'm very concerned. I've been concerned for a long period of time about the underlying messages that are being promoted on national qualifications for senior posts, whether that's MPQH or MPQEL or whatever, about what an effective school looks like. And what you're saying, Anthony, is I know people will say, many people on the course will say, when I speak to them, yeah, I agree with you, Anthony. I agree, that's the starting point, but we can't stay there. You know what I mean? But there are some children who need to stay there, don't they? You know what I mean? There's this sense that it's all about that academic journey means that actually by progressing that journey too quickly, actually we lose the position that we've created again, for that young person.
Yeah, I mean, I'll come to that if that's all right,
Yeah,
because
please.
that's my learning along the way. But so I got the job, and on my first day, I looked out of the window. There were 3 police vans in the car park. There was a year 11 boy being sectioned. He was attacking his dad. The police were attacking him. And then I walked into the main body of the building, and the kids were causing £80,000 worth of damage a year, kicking doors through, and there was no learning going on. And I had one of those oh dear moments where I thought, what have I done? I've committed career suicide. I can't go back to mainstream now. And I've got 130 children that the Tameside schools don't want or don't know how to manage. and I've got to learn this, and everything I know and all, your teacher toolkit does not even touch the surface.
Yeah.
So I reached out to special school heads and to PRU heads, which is how I met Alan, and they were all talking this language of trauma and attachment. And I did do the diploma with trauma informed schools, and I started reading. What happened was I fell down a trauma and attachment rabbit hole, and this is the bit that I'm evangelical about now. It absolutely changed my life. It changed how I parent. It changed how I believe in my own relationship, and it absolutely changed how I run the PRU. And because of my role across the authority, I was able to go to the local authority and say to them, we've got to do some of this differently. And we sort of trialed some of it with the PRU for about a year. And then I had a blank sheet of paper. So I did a pilot with some secondary schools, and then a more recent funded pilot with 14 primary schools. And we had a growing group of people that were concerned about behaviour in schools, that were saying traditional behaviour approaches weren't working. And gradually we built up an approach that is so compelling, and we've got evidence behind it that it works, that we were like, we really need to, this is the change that needs to happen, and somebody's got to. I think the other side is I sat in so many meetings with so many people talking about it, but nobody was doing anything. And I needed to do something to make that PRU. And so that's where it came. And then almost exactly a year ago, I've been doing a load of work with Alan, and Alan said, do you think maybe we should write this down? Do you think we should turn this into a book? And so we started didn't we, this time last year? And it was, they say, don't they, with a book, write about what you know. So, yeah. I mean, the funny thing is I was an English teacher, so I've always wanted to write a book.
So you wanted the book about 600 pages.
Yeah, and Alan's a maths teacher and said, I can't write more than a page. So we've had a great time. I mean, Alan will speak in a minute, I'm sure. I think it was one of the easier, if I ever write another book, I don't think it could be more straightforward, because I've been presenting and talking to people, we've been to Andy Burnham, we've got to Angela Rayner, we've talked to so many people that it was quite literally telling people the journey we've been on.
Yes. So Alan, I mean, how did you weave yourself into this story then?
Well, when like I said, when I arrived in special with children with very, very complex needs, thinking I knew it all, realising I didn't, you then go out and you start looking for the answer. And there wasn't a lot out there. There wasn't a lot of information. There was lots of advice from EPs and, specialists that knew what they were talking about. And I kind of got it, but it was trying to translate that into what would work in a school. And it challenged every aspect of my thinking about what a good school was going to be. So even though it wasn't a PRU, it was a special school, and the kids were moved there. I've got a kind of bit of a mantra at the moment with the rise in EHCPs that actually, to a certain extent, they're being used as a form of exclusion.
Yes,
and that counts for a lot of the rise in the EHCPs since 2015. And children were arriving sometimes through the PRU, but haven't been out of education for a very, very long time. And, I had more generous staffing, smaller groups, greater freedoms. So I could do all of those things, but it wasn't really, I was looking for the answer of what it is I had to do. And, I went down all sorts of different routes, some of which worked and some of which didn't. But what I was very clear about is trying to reproduce a kind of a strict system that of rules and regulations that has already failed these children was never going to work. And what became very clear to me was that, if it was all just about rules, then surely after 100 and odd years of formal education, we'd have worked out what those rules should be.
Yeah.
And then, all schools would work to that, and we could just nick somebody else's. So it was clearly there was just a lot more to it. So I started looking around, looked at something called emotion coaching, and realised that it was about the brain's architecture. And these children are no different to the rest of us. We're all built the same. We're all exactly the same, and probably would react in the same situation given some of the backgrounds that they have. And I think what's become very, very clear now is that, if you are from a disadvantaged background, if you have social care involvement, if you are looked after child, you're up to something like 80 or 90% certain to be excluded.
Mm.
And, one of the things I keep using in some of the training that I do is that, I look back on my life and, watch some things on TV like Bernard Manning, and you think, really? What were we thinking? Did we really like that? And my hope is that we'll look back in 20 years' time and say, so what was the approach for people who were really struggling with their emotions? You kicked them out of school? That doesn't seem quite right. And it doesn't to me. It's never sat right with me. So there has to be another way.
Can I just jump in as well there? Because the other thing that we've found along the way is people sort of shoehorn this and say, well, this is for naughty children, or this is for the disaffected and the disadvantaged. And actually, what we've learned is that this is better for everybody. And if I can give you a quick anecdote, I've got 3 children, and I'm hoping my children don't have trauma, they don't have attachment issues. My middle daughter's an absolute angel. I always laugh because I say she's gorgeous. I don't mean that the other 2 aren't, but she's an absolute angel. And when she was in reception, one of the members of staff asked her to hold the door open, and we're talking about a 4 or 5-year-old here, and she didn't hold the door open. So they put her on the sad cloud. And the other thing that my daughter's very good at doing is crying. So she cried and cried and cried and cried and cried. And they very quickly took her off the sad cloud. Now, bearing in mind, this is a good girl that does everything that she should do. And that's not just because I'm a dad, And I don't tell the story for this. It was a year later at bath time that she told her mum and me that story. So she'd carried that incident with her for a whole year. And that's for a child coming from a very stable and loving environment. So this kind of punitive punishment without thinking about what's going on behind it has really damaging and long-lasting effects that all of us have been in education a long time, and we don't do that intentionally. But when you learn about the brain and the neuroscience and the nervous system, that's some of the secondary trauma that we are accidentally putting onto young people. And that isn't what we should be doing. That's not why I came into teaching.
Now, it's interesting because in the book you talk about and actually we mustn't see it as a spectrum, should we? Which is in a way, but you talk about the behaviourists and the relationists, and we on the chat, I think we've had people who are sympathetic to both angles.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about a line, but but both positions are embraced by people who visit the. And I have to say, when I think back on my career, I do a sort of pulsing thing, So I can see. I think I'm probably more on the relationist side, but there are times when I sort of desperately want to get over a little bit more to the behaviourist side. I don't know if that's something that is normal. That I'm probably not an advocate of one position. I don't know. It's that probably because that's how I've reacted as a senior leader. In various
In
jobs.
my experience, Frank, it's having that relationship first, which means that you can chat with a child, you can talk to a child on a level that means you can explain the reason for rules and what rules and actually get the children to agree what rules are there and what rules are not. And I always think back to teaching in the middle of Salford and a year 6 girl who'd sworn at a teacher and the teacher wanted her excluded. Now in that school that wasn't rare, but I sat down with this young girl and we talked about it, and I said, I think you owe the teacher an apology. And she said, well, she owes me one because she shouted at me first. And I said, well, maybe she does, but I can't make her do that. But I can ask you to apologize for your language. And that's what I think you should do, but it's up to you. And that relationship meant that was close. I actually felt all along that the teacher was in the wrong position and was in the wrong school, to be honest, because she was one of those that didn't bend. And I always used to say, in the wind, grass bends. If it doesn't bend, it snaps.
Yeah.
And you've got to learn to bend with these children.
Yeah.
Once you had that relationship, you could ask them to do anything. Somebody came to the school and said, but what's behaviour like? I had two lads walking up the corridor, year six lads. I said, lads, just sit down and put your hands on your head, will you? They both did it. And I said, that's what behaviour's like here. And then I had to take those two lads aside and apologise for using them like that because it wasn't fair to them. I was trying to demonstrate something. And I thanked them for doing what I asked them to do and said I was just trying to show somebody how we work here. And they were fine with it. But if I hadn't apologised or hadn't had a conversation with them, they would have resented that because I was embarrassing them in front of a stranger.
You're going to
I
say,
think
Emma?
some people think at times that, Frank, what you were talking about, that continuum, is that if you're a relationalist, you don't believe in any rules and the kids
Yeah.
can do what they like. And that's certainly not what I believe in. I believe in high expectations, good behaviour, good attitudes, and all the rest of it. But it's, as Stan says, it's how you have a relationship with the children. We all know children when somebody comes along and says, I can't do anything with this child, they're appalling, they've done this, that, and the other, and all the rest of it. And it's like, okay, so are they like that with every member of staff? Oh no, they're not. Like, they've got a great relationship with that one. And it's like, well, why don't you replicate that? What's it about this teacher that it isn't working? Oh, well, they're a bit strict, they're a bit one-dimensional. Well, don't try to change the child, change the environment that the child is in. But I think the behaviourists, it's about control, whereas we know that children like routine. They like to know what the boundaries are, what the expectations are, but it's a far more human way of doing it.
Yeah.
Can I just come in as well then,
Yeah.
if that's all right? Frank, you were talking about you sort of drifting between being a behaviourist and a relationalist.
I don't know whether I hadn't really thought about it until you started chatting about it, folks. But I was thinking there are times when I've sort of, again, Anthony, it's just when Stan was mentioning about that, I was in my second headship was it was a joyous experience. It really was. And people used to go berserk because the children would have to queue up for lunch outside my office. So you got 350 kids all queued up, and you might be in a meeting, with somebody or on the phone, and all you can hear outside is just kids' noise, So there are more often than not, I just ignored it. But there were a couple of times, well, probably more than a couple. I thought I've had enough of this, So I felt as though that's where I'd go out, I'd assert myself, It would all calm down for a bit, not forever. And then, I come back. So that's where I feel when Stan mentioned his story, that's where I was, Anthony, in terms of how I was perhaps, over there, but actually felt myself moving out towards asserting myself.
And I think so where I was coming in is, we basically, especially in terms of approaches to behaviour, we still have quite a Victorian approach, about this, you need to do this at this point, and we haven't changed very much. That it's in the book, this, 100 and odd years, we still have this almost, some people believe children should be seen and not heard. I was still, when I did my teacher training, we were still told, don't smile till Christmas. So when we talk about why us as sort of more experienced teachers feel this conflict, is because that was the education we received. And you can go down the line, well, it didn't do me any harm. But we do know about the neuroscience now, and we do know that although, yes, that is how it was, just because we used to do it that way doesn't mean it was right. And as Alan said, if those rules all worked, we wouldn't be having this discussion now because everybody would be getting great GCSEs. What we do know is that lots of children are really struggling and lots of families are really struggling. And if you're just not eaten for a day, the last thing that you're thinking about when you're going into school is maths or phonics or, because you're hungry and all you can think about is being hungry. And similarly, if you have attachment issues because either your parent, some parents, money's really tight at the moment. They're working multiple jobs. So even with attachment, it isn't necessarily a blame thing. There might be nobody there in the morning. We all know children like that. They get themselves up, they get themselves to school, they make themselves the tea. But what they crave is that love and attention that human beings and as animals need biologically. And if you don't get that again, what you don't concentrate on is learning. What you concentrate on is how to get that. We used to call it attention seeking, but it's how to get that attachment and connection. And
Are there though, Anthony, some challenges here? I mean, because what's coming to me is um, in a primary phase, early years phase, predominantly same teacher. You build up that relationship over time. You know the parents, you know their circumstances, you can detect the change or the shift in thinking. As soon as children enter a secondary environment where they may have as many as 13 or 15 teachers a week who perhaps only see them every fortnight in some cases, isn't that just the recipe for the lack of sort of care, the lack of love, the lack of awareness about personal circumstances? Isn't that just where it could, if it's not handled well, be where those problems arise?
Yeah, but again, it's all about how you set your school up, isn't it? So if you think the other side, so you got this kid that's not behaving, so the teacher gets all cross with them, and then either they send them out or somebody else comes and collects them, and then they go somewhere else, and then the parents get phoned and they get phoned, and that takes an incredible amount of time, and it's not good for the teacher's well-being, it's not good for the child's well-being, it's not good for the family's well-being. Now, with those same resources, we've got the skill. You can stand on the school gates and you can spot those children when they walk in the morning. So it's that phrase, isn't it? It's Einstein's phrase. What is it? The definition of insanity: doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So if we know this with the children, let's pick up that same amount of time. Let's pick up in the morning and have a quick check-in with them. Let's settle that nervous system,
Yeah.
because we know if we don't do that, that will escalate throughout the day, and it's going to take hours and hours of time to unpick. Whereas sometimes, and we've done this multiple times with the work we've been doing, pick them up in the morning, sit them down somewhere, give them, they call it an emotionally available adult in trauma and attachment terms, but have a trusted adult that they can sit down with. We can look at how they're feeling. We can look at some strategies to manage that. And it might take 10 minutes and it might take 20. But if you don't do that, it's going to waste the rest of the day for a whole multitude of staff, because that child will dysregulate. So it swings around about.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
can
I
pick it up
think
late or you can early detect it.
picking up on what Frank's saying, I think part of it is a significant difference between primary and secondary. And sometimes I think, in primary, I've coped with what you would call a difficult child. We've made them happy that they are not disruptive, but we've not really solved anything. We've just created an atmosphere where they can operate. And then they go to secondary school and they're excluded within 3 or 4 weeks. And you just think maybe we weren't solving things. We were just making things easy for ourselves and for the child. And
I
there's
think
new
that's very true. Primary schools, rather than containing the child and dealing and keeping a hold of them, that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about building resilience in that child.
Yes.
Building the ability to handle their emotions.
I have to
and
challenge you on the
understand
word
them.
resilience, but I'll come
I
back to
know,
that in a
I
sec.
know. Yeah, absolutely. Because these children are probably the most resilient of anything. But I always struggled with that one because I wasn't sure what it is. It's basically about building the neural networks and helping them to understand the feelings of the emotions and how to deal with them and what the options are. So I think primary school has got an element of to play in the kind of future of it. But secondary schools, where the child turns up and is clearly struggling, and they say, this child's not school ready, I think it's one of the most appalling phrases that I've ever heard.
I agree.
I can think of numerous occasions where, as a primary head, I was literally shocked by feedback from the high school about some of my star pupils who were under threat of suspension. And basically, it appeared to me, and this is a massive generalization, the brightest ones were bored stiff at what they were given,
Yeah.
and opted out. And the ones with emotional difficulties had nobody to go to and nobody to turn to. And both ends of the sort of academic spectrum, the secondary school wasn't dealing with. It was dealing with some sort of middle line that everyone had to follow.
I was the independent education chair of the Blackpool board for secondary and primary schools. And we had a new head come into one of the secondary schools, and she summed it up. She said that what the primary schools in Blackpool have done with challenging children, they've created things like the Blossom Room, or the she called another one the Green Room, or the nursery room. You know, where actually all that happened was that's where the boys and girls went, and somebody kept an eye on them. And picking up on the point that Alan was making, that actually, you know, thinking about it, there was no resolution. It was not about sort of talking through how we can manage this. You know, it was really about containment. And so, in effect, the secondary heads were sort of clear that actually they felt as though they were being set up to fail, and they were picking up on the fact that their view was that primary schools hadn't properly addressed the concern and engaged with other services early enough to sort of try and resolve some of the issues. So that was an excuse also for why there was high exclusion rates in some of those secondary schools. You know, I get that, but yeah, go on.
If I can come in there, if that's all right. So, you know, again, there's two things that flagged up, and this is what we've done with our pilot. So one is, in schools, we generally operate a crisis management system. So we wait till it all explodes and then try and put some wraparound care in. And so what we've tried to do with the pilot is let's flag these kids early. So, you know, maybe they're coming in and something just doesn't look quite right, or the clothes just look a bit different. And then let's start building it from there, which is why we did our first pilot with secondary. And then I thought, the sooner we can work with these children, and like I said, it's not about nurturing and just putting them in a room, and it's about how do we build this. And then what we've got is a core competency program, if I can describe it very quickly. We took it from some EEF research, but we work with some young children and we design a program, we co-design it with the school, so it isn't one where you can photocopy and pass to the next school, because I don't believe in that. But the first unit lasts a half term, and it's about self-awareness. Because what you find with these children is they have no idea that this is what they're doing. So let's have it. We do a whole unit on self-awareness. And then the second unit is about self-management. So now that you know that you have a tendency to kick, or a tendency to swear, or a tendency to jiggle about, what strategies, how do we recognize that? What can we do to manage it? Then the third one is social awareness. Because the other thing that they often say is, it's him, it's her, she doesn't like me. Well, are you aware, now that you know that you're doing some of these things, can you see that that has an impact on other people? And so just that social awareness. And then relationship skills is the fourth one. Because now we can't all get on with everybody. We don't all get on with everybody. So how do we coexist in a school environment and build relationships? You know, it's that traditional thing of boys going and kicking a girl that they fancy. How do we do that in a different way? How do we recognize that? How do we get that attachment that we need positively, not negatively? And then the final unit is responsible decision making. So now that we know all of that, are we able to make a choice that's different to an emotional response? And what we found with the pilot is that this has had massive impact. We've got the data behind it. But I think the really interesting thing for me is that it didn't dip over. It went over the summer. But when they came back in September, you know, traditionally kids come back after September and you've got that dip. We didn't have that with this group of children. So it suggests that they're starting to embed. Now, I think if you've got these children and then you've got all these skills that they've learned, then what we need to look at is a transition package that says, this is what we've learned. This is what works. Here's all the evidence. And it's dead easy to do. You know, we're not asking to change the school day, or you just need to do these three things.
Yeah. Just picking up Alan, I mean, Alan, do you think some teachers are really skilled at doing this, but aren't aware of it?
Absolutely. And I think we all know who they are in the schools. We've worked with them. And, you know, they're like a child magnet. The kids just love them to bits. You know, the younger ones follow them around at break time and all the rest of it. But it happens in secondary school as well. You know, quite often it can be, you know, like the PE teachers or something, you know. I think they exist in every school. And equally, the people who are not very emotionally aware also exist in every school.
Yeah.
And I think that can change. I think with a good program of training, and giving people the skills so that you don't just, I mean, we talk about it in the book about the training that we had and still goes on. This idea, I mean, it sounds ridiculous, don't smile till Christmas, but I asked somebody who's a recently qualified teacher and said, well, what kind of advice did he get? She repeated the same thing, so still doing the rounds. So, these are things that can be taught. I didn't naturally come from a background where, I was happy talking about my emotions or thinking about it. And, exactly the opposite. It's like, you just don't talk, get up, stop crying. It's like, 1970s Northeast. But, we can all learn it and we can all learn to be different. And going back to where we started with this and what Anthony said, this isn't just for naughty children. This is for everybody.
Yeah.
We all respond better to this.
So the book coming out on the 31st, is it? Or
Monday, I believe.
Monday, yeah. And the title is, and who's it with?
So it's Educating Everyone, an Introduction to Relational Inclusion in Schools. And obviously it's me and Alan, published by Routledge. And I think what's different about the book is it's a kind of merge of a few things. So there's our story, because we're not saying we're brilliant at this, and we're not saying we've done it all wrong. I've done absolutely everything I say we shouldn't do. So there are those kind of anecdotes about.
Yeah, that journey's really powerful, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
That journey's really powerful.
And then there's the theory and research behind it to say, in our, I'm not a scientist and I'm not a neuroscientist, so it's kind of an easy to understand. This is the theory and research that is supporting what we're saying. And there's 50 years of that, it's not like 2 years old. And then some practical, this is how you could apply some of this into your schools. So I think there's it's a different kind of book, really. I mean, I would say that we've written it, but the early feedback we've had from people that have read it have echoed what we're saying there. Yeah.
Okay, so and also at the end of the video, for those who are watching on the podcast, there is a discount code, isn't there, if they use that? Because they won't see the video. At the end of the video, I'll put the code in, but what's the discount code if they want to?
Frank Stan 30.
Okay.
And the number's 30 rather than the words.
And that gets you 30% off?
Yeah, only through, you have to order it through the publisher, though.
Through the publisher. That's brilliant. Well, I tell you what, gentlemen, it would be great to have you back next year.
Yeah.
Just to hear, where are you in your thinking? What impact has the book had? I found it really, really interesting. I feel as though we've just skimmed it. We didn't get into any of the principles and all this sort of stuff, did we? But actually, let's do that next time. And I hope followers of Frank and Stan Chat have enjoyed it as much as we have. Again, if this is affecting your family at the moment, and it is affecting mine, there is a sense of optimism that you've given to me today. And I hope that that's conveyed as well to others who are sort of, trying to manage the best they can, some difficult situations with their children. So anyway.
I think when you're a grandparent, Frank, you see things more holistically, don't you?
You do.
And because I've got a grandson now, and we noticed his non-conformist of painting daffodils at nursery, whereas every other child had painted a nice wide line yellow at the top. Howard's had his hands in it. I will not be told how. And then the other photographs that the nursery send of them all working, he's somewhere in the far corner doing something completely different. So I suspect we may have some issues later.
What we don't want, though, Stan, you and I will have heard this, won't we, from our days when we worked with HMI. What we don't want are pastiches. We don't want a pastiche. We want their creativity, don't we? We want their spirit. We want what they're bringing.
I think a non-conformist artist is what we've got. What they're like.
Well, some of them make an awful lot of money in life, don't they? So it can't be that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, gents, so much for this.
Thank you very much.
And Frank and Stan Chat will be back very shortly. So until then, goodbye from all of us. Bye-bye.
Right.